The Crisis of Islamic Civilization by Ali A. Alawi, Chapter 5, The Reformations of Islam. When the West reconciled religion and freedom, it did so by making the individual the focus of society, and the price it has paid has been individualism run rampant in the form of weak marriages, high rates of crime, and alienated personalities. When Islam kept religion at the expense of freedom, it did so by making the individual subordinate to society, and the price it has paid has been autocratic governments, religious intolerance, and little personal freedom. James Q. Wilson, The Reformed Islam Needs. City Journal, Volume 12, Number 4, 2002. The global concern with Islam's reformation began to emerge at the end of the 1980s. Almost on cue, Islam rose to take the place of the communist bloc in the demonology of the former Cold War warriors. The decade of the 1990s was dominated by a growing sense of alarm in most of the world about the threat from politically radical Islam. The return of thousands of Arab fighters to their homelands from Afghanistan war set the stage for violent changes to the status quo in a number of Muslim countries. This was only slightly counterbalanced by concern for the plight of Muslims at the receiving end of the other's violence, especially the Balkans. The West, in particular, began to see Islam in a new light, partly as an energizer of forces which were bent on challenging Western hegemony and the rules of the new unipolar order. Samuel P. Huntington produced his important thesis on the clash of civilizations in a 1992 essay, which was later expanded into a book. Islam was clearly identified as the main protagonist of the conflict and the discord in the world. 2 years earlier, in 1990, the historian Bernard Lewis wrote a very influential essay on the roots of Muslim rage. It was subtitled Why So Many Muslims Deeply Resent the West and Why Their Bitterness Will Not Be Easily Mollified. 1990s also saw the rise of the neoconservative movement in the US. Neoconservatives held often deeply antipathetic views about an unreformed Islam, which were reflected in the think tanks and journals which represented their ideological line. Commentators such as Daniel Pipes became influential advocates of a secularized Islam and contributed to the climate of opinion which divided Islam into a moderate wing, which acknowledges the supremacy of Western values, and a recalcitrant radical wing, which is bent on confronting and undermining the West. The idea that Muslims in the West could be some kind of fifth columnist for radical Islam gained currency in the 1990s. It coincided with the recognition that Islam had set deep roots inside Western societies and that a large cohort of European-born Muslims was angry and in danger of becoming radicalized. Islamophobia entered the lexicon. It was defined in 1997 by a British Runnymede Trust as the dread or hatred of Islam and therefore the fear and dislike of all Muslims. But it was after the 11th September 2001 attacks on New York and Washington that the calls to reform Islam reached unprecedented and cacophonous levels. It was not only intellectuals and scholars that made these demands. They were joined by politicians, journalists, novelists, actors, media stars, and all manner of self-proclaimed experts on Islam. One sought to find the reasons behind the self-immolation of a few nihilists. Those who tried to limit the debate to the culpability of the perpetrators themselves were drowned out by the often explicit assertion that the entire heritage of Islam was a fault. It appeared as if the whole world had closed ranks and was pointing an accusing finger at Islam. The expressions of revulsion which were manifested towards the terrorists by a huge number of Muslims, including tens of thousands of candle-bearing Iranians who expressed their solidarity with the victims and their families, made little impression in the overall mood of disgust, sourness, and fear that gripped the world. Some academics and clergymen sought to refute the connection of the terrorists with Islam, but few paid attention to them. The parade of apologetic Muslims who popped up on the post 9/11 airways failed to dent the profound anti-Islamic sentiment that had taken hold. Of course, as the aftershocks of the attacks subsided, more nuanced and reasoned analysis of Islam were formed. But the underlying thrust did not materially alter. Islam was in sore need of reformation, and it would be cajoled, pressured, goaded, and even need be forced into accommodating and acknowledging the values of the modern world. An entire industry emerged that purported to understand and explain the causes of Islam's retrogression, its inability to modernize, and its supposed proneness to violence and intolerance. Reforming a recalcitrant religion. The calls to reform Islam in the post 9/11 world all had the same objectives: to remold the environment of Muslim countries and societies towards realizing a specific set of desirable outcomes in the future. What these outcomes were depended, of course, on who was prescribing the reform. In this sense, would-be reformers of Islam would include not only liberals but radicals and fundamentalists, and Muslims as well as non-Muslims who had appropriated for themselves the right to intervene in or to direct the affairs of the Muslims. The idea was to encourage a gradual or abrupt break with those elements of Islam that were seen to be problematic in terms of the reformers' own goals. These goals included the enhancement of the internal security of the US or European countries, the secularization of Muslim societies, the spread of human and civil rights, or from another perspective, the imposition of a theocracy and the return to an imaginary past. Apart from the breathtaking arrogance and even stupidity of these projects, for who has ever heard of reforming Buddhism, Hinduism, or Confucianism, let alone Christianity, as a global objective? It is clear that the real damage could result if reformers were afforded the means to implement such designs. In every age since the eruption of the West into the Islamic heartlands, an act which is best symbolized by the Napoleonic occupation of Egypt has had its share of philosophical fixes for the Muslims' dilemma. In many ways, the history of the modern Islamic thought can be read as one continuous series of remedies to what was perceived as decline and impending doom. However, the vital factor that made the preoccupation with Islam more serious and ominous this time was the switch of the world's hyperpower from a policy of benign neglect and frequently cynical indifference towards the travails of Muslims to one of combating literally the forces of radical Islam on a global basis. The vast resources of the United States were brought to bear on the problem of Islam and on the reformation of Islam. One of the more potent ideas for the reformation of Islam was, in reality, a repetition of the old 19th century critique of Islam by the latter-day heirs of Renan and the likes of Sir William Moir, a Victorian author of vituperative but influential biography of the Prophet Muhammad. The backdrop had shifted away from Islam's compatibility with science and rationalism towards Islam's compatibility with the supposedly universal values embodied in modern democratic societies. The old criticisms remained, but they were overshadowed by newer and more immediate concerns. Islam was now being assessed in relation to the concepts such as pluralism, universal human rights, democracy, and freedom. The linear view of human progress and cultural evolution drawn from the Western experience became the test case for Islam's path towards its own reformation. A reductionist rendering of the Reformation in Europe became the model Islam should follow. Islam had to be challenged by disruptive, provocative, and possibly subversive readings of its own dogmas and creeds. In the process, Islam would be refashioned as to provide a welcome reception to the notions of the liberal democratic world. The parallels with the Christian Reformations were fallacious. Reasoning by historical analogy was the vogue in the post 9/11 environment, but the inferences drawn were hopelessly inappropriate for Islam. The Reformation affected the Catholic Church in Central and Western Europe only. The unity of Christendom had been sundered with the division of the Roman Empire, and the Eastern Church had already had a physical, separate, and independent existence from the Western Church for nearly a millennium before the Reformation. The narrative of the Reformation in the Western Christianity, to which Islam was compared, had it as its starting point the revolt of the individual against the authority of a hierarchical institution whose presence and intercession with God was essential as a matter of dogma. The ground was prepared by humanist scholars such as Erasmus and by the opening of a reinterpretation of scriptures based on his accurate translations. The victory of science and natural philosophy over theology and dogma was another immensely significant outcome of the Reformation, as the linear narrative would have us believe. The Catholic Church, at the height of the 30-Year War, saw fit to subject Galileo to the Roman Inquisition for his heretical beliefs on the laws of motion, but the religious faith was no match for the empirical evidence in the understanding of the natural world. The story of the benefits of the Reformation continues into the political arena, where the religious dissenters of England, Germany, and the Low Countries, moving across of the Atlantic, plant in the New World the seeds for the separation of state from an established church. In economics and business, the Calvinist doctrines relating to the interconnection between thrift work and the salvation of the elect are held to be the causal factors in the advance of capitalism and hence of the modern business organizations. The Industrial Revolution is thus only one step away from the Reformation. Who can doubt that the Industrial Revolution started in the Protestant strongholds of England and northwestern Europe? The Reformation becomes a prehistory of the Enlightenment, which finally succeeds in banishing religion from the public arena. A monolithic Latin Christianity is fragmented into a multifaceted faith with many churches. Religious wars are replaced by religious toleration, which is only a transit station to secularism and then to pluralism. Both the Reformations and the Enlightenment are necessary phases in the taming of the religious faith and in opening mankind to the possibilities of the post-religious order. Now, if only Islam could follow the same path, without, of course, the 200 years of violence and devastation which the Reformation actually unleashed, then Islam would be shorn of its dogmatic certainties, which are antithetical to human advancement. It could then fit into the structures of modern world. This bare outline of the march of the West has been questioned and in many cases discredited by historians, but is still presented as incontrovertible evidence for Islam to undergo a similar rite of passage as Western Christianity. On closer inspection, however, the utility of the analogy falls apart. The parallels are absurd. Islam does not have a church with a fossilized hierarchy at whose apex rests the supreme religious authority. Reforming such a church has no meaning in the Islamic context. Perhaps the Islamic Revolution in Iran introduced the rule of a church-like hierarchy, but this was the result of an epochal and revolutionary event and an inversion of the idea of Protestant-type Reformation. A religious hierarchy was imposed on the state when none had existed before, scarcely a reformation in the European sense. At the same time, the majority Muslims were not living in countries governed under the Sharia law, with the exception of a few self-consciously Islamic states such as Saudi Arabia and lately Iran. It was difficult, therefore, to posit the reformation of Islam specifically in terms of reforming the Sharia if its provisions were no longer applicable outside the framework of family law or personal law. The abandonment of Sharia law has been effected by and large during the colonial and immediately post-colonial era. So the effort of Islam either on the formal structures of government or on its laws, has been minimal in most of Islamic world. Among Muslim communities in Europe or in the countries where Muslims form a large majority, Muslims were subjected to the law of the land. In India, the large Muslim population had recourse to Sharia rulings only in the matters of personal or family law. The putative calls to reform Islam would and could not apply to Muslim states or to their legal systems, except in matters of personal law. Reforming Islamic personal law certainly did have implications for gender rights, but this was a special limiting case. Islam was therefore not an obstacle for the reformation of state structures or for the introduction of new political doctrine. The conflict between Islam and democracy could not arise in the context of Muslim countries whose entire political legacy was based on an authoritarianism which only used Islam to justify its rule. Outside the few Islamic states and traditional monarchies such as Morocco, Islam was not used to justify the legitimacy of the ruling groups, except through a formal and meaningless lip service to Islam as the religion of the state in constitutions of a number of Muslim countries. In addition, the number of Muslims living in actual or self-proclaimed democracies reached more than a third of the world's Muslim population. The issue was not therefore reforming an Islam already in power, but reforming an Islam which could come to power, a crucial difference. The Islam that could come to power was a worrisome eventuality. The proposals for reforming Islam took on a precautionary, even preemptive character, especially when they emanated from those keen to avert a repetition of the Iranian Revolution, the spread of radical Wahhabism, or jihadi culture of Al-Qaeda and its offshoots. The ideology of the terrorists was assessed alongside Islamic orthodoxy to see if the two were intertwined. What were the roots of terror and radicalization? The last time when Islam as a religion and as a civilization was subjected to such intense scrutiny was in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when European imperialists were encountering widespread resistance. Rise of totalitarian states and the Cold War relegated Islam to being a minor concern, except where its political influence coincided with the national liberation movements of the period. However, as the dismantling of the colonial empires was a firm policy position of the US, it was unlikely that Islam as an enabling ideology in the anti-colonial movement would incur the wrath of the US. In fact, the usefulness of Islam as a counterweight to communism was also a feature in the Cold War, although the CIA seems not to have financed Islamic movements directly or supported Islamic causes through front organizations such as the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Nevertheless, Islam became a firm ally of the West during the final years of the Cold War, when Afghan Mujahideen movement, stiffened with Arab and Central Asian volunteers, helped to bring the Soviet Empire to the end. But the period that followed the collapse of the Soviet bloc put paid to this indifference, and the old prejudice and concerns rose up, being backed even by allies from within the Muslim world itself. The turn to violence. In the search for culprits for Islam's turn to violence, most roads passed through Wahhabism and went back to the medieval theologian Ibn Taymiyyah. But there was a short interlude between the 1980s and the mid-1990s when revolutionary Shia Islam was probed in order to reveal its potential for causing violence and instability. The argument was that Shiism is inherently revolutionary and disruptive, and this was the drive behind most of the insurrectionary movements in Islamic history. It is prone to being led or misled by its guardians, who uniquely in the world of Islam have a status which is equivalent to an official religious hierarchy. Shia rituals have the capacity to galvanize emotions to dangerously unstable levels. Their images of martyrdom and sacrifice can be exploited by unscrupulous leaders to mobilize millions of the faithful to acts of violence and self-sacrifice. The example of the hordes of Iranian youth willingly going to their certain deaths in Iran-Iraq war, carrying plastic keys to the gates of Imam Hussein's shrine in Karbala, was frequently used to emphasize the irrational nature of the passions that motivated the Shia. Images of crowds beating their chests and hitting their heads with the flat swords were powerful reminders that a religion of lament can quickly turn its energies from self-inflicted wounds to an outer enemy. But Shiism is also characterized by an introversion which denies the legitimacy of any state authority and stays well away from political entanglements. This feature formed a counter-narrative to the revolutionary Shiism of Ayatollah Khomeini. Upon his death, the revolutionary and destabilizing zeal of Shiism seemed to decline, leaving only the Islamic Republic of Iran as the dangerous force to be reckoned with, and not Shiism per se. During the build-up to the invasion of Iraq, the public image of Shia Islam was also softened as the US sought allies among the Shia opposition in exile and developed a working relationship with the Grand Ayatollahs of Najaf. But the possibility that Shia Muslims would ever lead a worldwide pan-Islamic movement opposed to the West was a non-starter, giving the distinct minority status of Shia in Islam. This was an issue which was deliberately played upon by both conservative and radical Sunnis to dispel the appeal of revolutionary Islam emanating from Shia Iran. It was unlikely, therefore, that the majority of Sunnis would look to Shiism for their revolutionary prompting. Burrowing into the arcane corners of Shia theology to find the roots of Islam's revolutionary potential against the West was soon abandoned. However, nearly all the latter-day radical and terrorist Islamist groups claim to fealty to the ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah. Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah was born in 1263 into a family of well-known scholars and jurists. His thought was directed towards the orthodox in the Sunni world and towards what he saw as the corruption of Islamic life through the spread of laws and customs that were outside of the ambit of the Sharia or of the prophetic practices. His railings at Bid'ah, the introduction of reprehensible innovations into Islam, were partly aimed at the entrenchment of traditions not rooted in Islam in the 13th century world of Damascus, which he inhabited. Syria at that time was under the rule of Mamluks, a Caucasian slave dynasty based in Egypt. Ibn Taymiyyah believed that there was always a basis for a single valid Sharia ruling for any event or circumstance. It was the function of the jurists and ulama of Islam to find this ruling. To this effect, he moved away from the traditional categories of using analogous reasoning or the consensus of scholar to limit the range of acceptable Sharia-based rulings by rejecting both the principle of emulating prior scholars, taqlid, or the restrictions on open-ended interpretations of Islam based on an independent reasoning, ijtihad. Ibn Taymiyyah established the possibility of finding Sharia-based solutions for any sets of problems and conditions, solutions that were free from the shackles of orthodox restrictions. Ibn Taymiyyah's own rulings, fatwas, were voluminous and dealt with every conceivable subject. His compendium continues to be a source of religious inspiration for every modern Wahhabi or Salafi Muslim. In some ways, his rejection of the blind imitation may have appeared to be liberating and potentially constructive, but there was also a string to the tail. The spiritual life of Islam became entirely Sharia defined. Everything that didn't meet the test of Ibn Taymiyyah's singular Sharia-based ruling became a form of bid'ah and therefore reprehensible and to be shunned. His understanding of the Quranic text was entirely literalist to the point of being anthropomorphic. He would affirm that God literally had hands and a face, detested shrines and the ceremonies associated with the birth and death of Sufi saints. His attitude to the Shia, in whatever form, was implacably hostile and aggressive. The Shia, of course, returned his hatred of them with their own unflattering epithets. His attitude to Sufism is riddled with contradictions and ambiguities, ranging from the complete condemnation and accusations of polytheism to a grudging respect for a few of its leading saintly figures. His hatred for the medieval mystic Ibn Arabi was intense, a trait which has carried to his modern day followers. Ibn Taymiyyah's effects on Islam have not been entirely constructive. His constant campaigns of vilification, directed as they were against all and sundry, and mixed with the occasional profundity, led to his being severely reprimanded by the leading scholars of the time. Even his own students condemned him for his indiscriminate attacks on the pious and righteous, and for his constant hurling of accusation of bid'ah. For his rejection of the key tenets of orthodox Sunni thought, Ibn Taymiyyah was sent to prison by 4 judges representing the 4 schools of laws in Sunni Islam. Even though hundreds of thousands of Damascenes attended Ibn Taymiyyah's funeral, his influence was quickly forgotten in the world of Islam and remained so until the advent of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of the Wahhabi movement in 18th century Arabia. Ibn Abdul Wahhab relied on Ibn Taymiyyah as the main source for his own Kitab al-Tawheed, the Book of Unity, the founding text of Wahhabism. However, the legacy of Salafism, which is a diluted version of Wahhabism, has been more pervasive in the Muslim lands. Salafism, which was more contemporary and less doctrinally primitive, has relied more extensively on the works of Ibn Taymiyyah. In Egypt, it was the arrival of the Tripolitan Muhammad Rashid Rida in 1897 that gave Salafism its first pan-Islamic champion. Rida's Al-Manar newspaper was a mouthpiece for the ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah and his deep dislike for Sufism, together with his insistence on the Ijtihad model of Ibn Taymiyyah, colored with modernism. Al-Manar had a huge impact and provided the principal intellectual prop for the spread of the Salafi movement to the far corners of the world. In fact, wherever the newspaper was read, the Wahhabi Salafi strain of Sunni Islam remained a minority position throughout most of the 20th century. Nearly all state-sponsored religious establishments in the Sunni Muslim world were dominated by an innate conservatism and avoided any direct political action that challenged the status quo. However, the rise of power of the Saudi state and the enormous growth of its financial resources paved the way for the widespread diffusion of its official Wahhabi doctrine. The center of gravity of Sunni world has thus shifted markedly in the past 2 decades towards Wahhabi Salafi interpretations, rooted as these are in the system of Ibn Taymiyyah. The effect has been to radicalize Sunni Islam by weakening its connection with the classical schools of law. These are inherently moderate, restrained, and subtle in their decisions and allowed for considerable flexibility and leeway in their implementation. Invariant rulings, which held sway for all times and places, were the exception rather than the rule. The rise of the Wahhabi Salafi system challenged these schools at a number of levels. Wahhabi Salafi thought followed Ibn Taymiyyah in rejecting allegiance to any of the 4 schools of laws as a formal requirement for the believer. The result was a barrage of obligatory rulings which ignored the laborious and limiting process by which conclusions and decisions had been previously achieved. The richness and variety of Islam was gradually stifled by tying the believer down through an incredible array of detailed regulations and rules. As the scholar Khalid Abu al-Fadl wrote in his 2001 dissection of the new authoritarianism in Islam, speaking in God's name, essentially contemporary ijtihad efforts often were the product of an authoritarian process that yield closed determinations, which effectively signaled the death of the same legal system that the ijtihad efforts hoped to reinvigorate. The usual process, if one can call it a process, of this code-like new ijtihad largely consisted of citing some anecdotal evidence or selective reports attributed to the Prophet and then declaring the law of God to be such or such. Given that the system is designed to produce uniquely appropriate rulings, the end result is that Wahhabism, Salafism, becomes a vehicle for a wide range of rulings which have canonical force. The death knell for Islamic law is sounding. All its vitality, originality, and positiveness fades away, turning it into a massive manual with rulings often drawn from the shoddy scholarship of bigoted clerics and Islamic activists with little jurisprudential training. Some of the rulings that have emanated from the official Wahhabi Council for Legal Opinions in Saudi Arabia have been truly outlandish and are objects of ridicule. A good many of them relate specifically to women, their freedom to work and travel, and their permissible inner and outer garments. Other rulings from Wahhabi clerics have been used by terrorists and jihadists to justify all manner of atrocities, including the 9/11 attacks. In a taped interview after the 9/11 attacks, bin Laden is seen discussing them with a Saudi cleric, who then gives the matter his blessing. Fatwas by radical Wahhabi clerics have justified mass murder against the Shia in Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, as well as a virulent hatred for the Sufi orders and for any manifestations of local Islam, and have provided the religious cover for a good part of the terrorism which has plagued the world. Accommodation and tolerance. Mutual tolerance between the varieties of Islamic faith and practice and accommodation of the non-Muslim populations who lived alongside Muslims formed an important element of Islamic civilization. Necessarily, the lead had to come from the majority religious groups, the Sunni orthodoxy in most cases, which acknowledged the legitimacy and rights of the minority groups. The operative word in Islam is accommodation, not tolerance. Accommodation is a permanent arrangement which implies the creation of a recognized and legitimate space for other religious and doctrinal groups. Tolerance, on the other hand, assumes the supremacy of one over the other, but allows the other to exist in sufferance. The Sunni-Shia relationship throughout most of Islamic history was one of accommodation rather than tolerance, in spite of important theological differences. Apart from the historical and social circumstances that would have encouraged accommodation between the various sects of Islam, the charge of kufr, infidelity, in Islam is a very grave one, and all the Islamic schools of law use extremely strict and narrow criteria in defining it. The purpose is to avoid any possibility of bloodshed and sedation and breaking the prized unity of the Muslim Ummah. The great theologian Al-Ghazali wrote the definitive treatise on the charge of kufr. In essence, any person who declares the statement of faith of Islam, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger, is ipso facto a Muslim. Al-Ghazali states categorically that there should be no branding any person an unbeliever over any secondary issue whatsoever as a matter of principle. The Shia doctrine of the hidden Imam might be objectionable as it is according to Al-Ghazali, but it is unconnected with the fundamentals of faith. This narrows unbelief either to denying the unity of God or to denying that Prophet Muhammad was the truthful in delivering his message. This viewpoint was echoed by the Shia Grand Ayatollahs. A number of them throughout history would have harsh words to say about the companions of the Prophet's wife Aisha, and the caliphs who preceded Ali. But in spite of their hostility to these key figures in Islam, such ayatollahs would not cast any Sunni Muslim into the circle of kufr. Thus, the leeway for accommodating diversity was very broad, and only a few extremist groups would whose roots in Islam are excluded from the community of Islam. These extremists, many of whom venerate Ali, the first Imam of the Shia, to the point of deification, are excluded because they implicitly deny the unity of God in their belief in immanence, hulul, and in doctrines such as transubstantiation. In the evolution of Islamic civilization, some of these extremists, for instance, the Nusayris and the Druze of Greater Syria, were pushed out of the main urban areas of Islam, mountain redoubts until modern times. The absence of a supreme ecclesiastic authority, even in Shia Islam, where the grand ayatollahs can and do disagree among themselves, makes it difficult to realize the establishment of a single orthodox dogma over all Muslims. The natural state of Islam is therefore diversity, and a broad range of sects and groups do coexist within it. In fact, there is an oft-quoted narration from the Prophet which celebrates the diversity of opinion within the scholars of the faith. It is astounding in modern Salafi eyes, for example, that the highest offices of the Abbasid Caliphate could ever be held by Shia. But the triumph of the Wahhabi Salafist school has eroded the natural elasticity of the Islamic community. The Wahhabi Salafi school could now claim that they had the right to determine who was within the faith. The closing of the Islamic mind, at least in this respect, is very much a modern phenomena. The global spread of Wahhabism, Salafism, is directly attributed to the massive financial support which is provided for the Wahhabi Dawa or mission by the Saudi state, and lately by wealthy businessmen and merchants. The role of the Wahhabist propaganda is the radicalization of Muslim youth in the ghettos of Western Europe or in the villages and slums of South Asia had been well documented. The sum total of this relentless activity to force the world of Sunni Islam into the straitjacket of Wahhabi Salafi thought has been the creation of the scaffolding of a new type of religious authority in Sunni Islam, one which may portend the establishment of a church-like institution which may come to dominate the world of Sunni Islam. The eagerly anticipated Islamic Reformation may very well end up as the diametrical opposite of what was expected, as a rigidifying of Islam managed by a uniquely intolerant and narrow-minded class of clerics drawn from a backwater of Islamic civilization and willingly cut off from the magnificent panorama of Islam's intellectual tradition. This process has been growing exponentially over the past 4 decades. The bastions of traditional Sunni learning have been undermined by their adoption of Wahhabist Salafist thought and by the latter's devaluation of the classical Islamic tradition. The prevailing Wahhabi Salafi ascendancy has had a profound effect on the world of Sunni Islam, contributing in no small measure to the narrowing of Muslims' religious and spiritual sensibilities. A dark cloud hovers over the world of observant Sunni Islam, the concern which the minutiae of religious life, the micro-regulation of daily activity, the smugness that accompanies dogmatic certainty, the joylessness of a fastidious religiously, the lack of interest or curiosity either in the past or in the multivariate aspects of Islam have all crept into the religious culture of observant Muslims. The celebrations, commemorations, and acts of piety that give Islam its dramatic sweep have been forced out. Local variants of traditional Muslim festivals, such as the veneration of the Prophet, are dismissed as bid'ah. Public expressions of spirituality are denied legitimacy. The culture of Islam is drained of vitality by a barren utilitarianism which shamelessly draws on the scientific and technical achievement of others and celebrates a crude materialism. It has no aesthetic sensibility and little or no literary creativity. When did this world last produce a single work of abiding scientific, intellectual, or literary merit, and who are its great architects, calligraphers, or poets? But there are telltale tell signs that the Sunni world is beginning to resist the type of future that this implies. The grip of Wahhabist Salafist thought was developing over Muslims suffered a serious setback after the 9/11 attacks. Muslims were driven partly by the ferocious attacks on their faith, which came from all quarters, to question the modern course of Islam. The need to re-examine entire aspects of Islam, including the rigid conservatism which was increasingly becoming its defining feature, was an important side effect of the post 9/11 fallout on the worldwide community of Muslims. Non-Arab Muslim countries, which had sent hundreds of students to the Wahhabi academies of Saudi Arabia, began to question the wisdom of this move. Countries such as Morocco, with its strong and historical commitment to the Maliki Madhab school of law, became suspicious of the Wahhabi doctrine, which denied the need to abide by the rulings of the particular school of law. They were also suffering from the blowback of returning Moroccans who had studied Islam at these schools and who had contributed to the radicalization of Moroccan Islam. Sufi orders began to proliferate anew, even inside the Wahhabi stronghold of Saudi Arabia. In 2005, thousands of mourners attended the funeral of a well-respected Sufi sheikh in Makkah, Sayyid Muhammad Alawi. He had been ostracized by the Wahhabi establishment and forbidden to hold classes in the Grand Mosque of Makkah. The terrible sectarian carnage in Iraq after the 2003 US invasion and its aftermath also gave pause to those who anathematized the Shia. Calls for inter-sectarian dialogue multiplied, leading to the 2005 Amman message of leading scholars of Sunni and Shia Islam. The Amman message. A number of organizations had been created in the past to try to bring together the two great schools of Islam. The most notable attempt was in the 1940s when the Al-Azhar University sponsored a formal body designed to draw together the two schools. However, with the increasing influence of anti-Shia Wahhabism on Sunni thought, this effort languished. The Amman message of 2005 was initiated by the King of Jordan and aimed to make clear the legitimate schools of Islam, the conditions of declaring a person an apostate, and the authorities entitled to issue rulings on matters of Islamic law and jurisprudence. It came at a time of increased sectarianism, tensions throughout the Muslim world, tensions partly brought on by the Iraq crisis and by increasing fears about international terrorism's possible use of Islamic religious rulings in order to justify acts of violence and indiscriminate killings. Scholars from all major Islamic schools of thought assembled in Amman. Actually, the Saudi government encouraged the participation of its state-sponsored ulama organization in the conference, and both Iran and Iraq sent high-level delegations from their Shia hierarchies to Amman. The result was an unequivocal call for Muslim unity, a condemnation of terrorism, and a forbidding of unsubstantiated fatwas issued by illegitimate groups who claimed religious authority. The conference's recommendations and resolution were approved by all the participants as well as by the Saudi government. The Saudi government had formally acknowledged that the Shia are in fact Muslims after all. The resolution affirmed the proximity to each other of the rulings of the religious schools of Islam and the fact that they all adhere to the essential pillars of Islam. But much to its credit, the resolution did not shrink from admitting that there were important theological differences between the sects. Finally, it denounced the issuing of fatwas by unauthorized individuals, a decision clearly aimed at radical and terrorist groups. Acknowledgements of the schools of Islamic jurisprudence, mazahib, within Islam means adhering to the fundamental methodology in issuance of fatwas. No one may issue a fatwa without the requisite qualifications of knowledge. No one may issue a fatwa without adhering to the methodology of the schools of Islamic jurisprudence. No one may claim to do unlimited ijtihad and create a new opinion or issue unacceptable fatwas that take Muslims out of the principles and certainties of the Sharia and what has been established in respect of its schools of jurisprudence. This vigorous statement from the assembled dignitaries of Islam reaffirmed the authority of tradition. Its focus on the school of Islam stressed the significance of centuries of learning in the formulation of Islamic rulings. Its signatories included, unsurprisingly, all the official religious institutions of the main Islamic countries, as well as important centers of learning and scholarship, such as Al Azhar scholars associated with the Salafi strain of Islam, also signed up, including Yusuf al Qaradawi, a former stalwart of the Muslim Brotherhood who now headed a state sponsored religious council in Qatar. The Saudi state stood firmly behind the new efforts to improve sectarian harmony. These efforts reflected both the reformist tendencies of King Abdullah ibn Abdul Aziz and genuine fears regarding the uncontrolled activities of radical Wahhabi clerical class. Nevertheless, the statement carried only a few signatories from the Wahhabi establishment. The raison d'etre that drove the Saudis and others to sign up for the declaration was not met by the Wahhabi establishment with an equal commitment to the new era of inter-sectarian harmony and brotherhood. A follow-up conference to the Amman meeting of Sunni and Shia scholars was held soon afterwards in Makkah. But in February 2006, scarcely 6 months after the Makkah conference, one of the Shia Islam's most sacred sites, the Al-Askariya shrine of the two Imams of Samarra, Iraq, was blown up by operatives of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. This unleashed an orgy of violence mainly directed at the Sunni population of Iraq. The ensuing mayhem reached near civil war levels, with thousands killed and hundreds of thousands internally displaced or fleeing to nearby countries. The more radical Wahhabi clerics of Saudi Arabia applauded the destruction of the shrine, while the officially sanctioned groups mostly kept silence. Ibn Jibrin, a notoriously anti-Shia cleric, was widely believed to have encouraged his followers to spread an underground fatwa calling for the destruction of all shrines, as shrines would encourage idolatry. Wahhabi practice in Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan is replete with incidents where historical sites, shrines, and tombs have been desecrated or destroyed. A notable case which achieved international notoriety was the 2001 destruction of the giant Buddha statues in Bamiyan province, Afghanistan by Taliban. Ibn Jibrin himself posted fatwa relating to the Shia and the Sufis, which were uniformly scathing and condemnatory. The wars within Islam were not going to disappear so quickly.